Okay, good afternoon. My name is Brian Lantz, and I'm here with the Schiller Institute, and we're going to be discussing the emerging new paradigm and also the increasing disorder and hysteria in the transatlantic area, Europe and the United States as well. Keisha Rogers has been making the point as she did last night in the LaRouche Pack webcast, that a new era is merging. That's a rejection of globalization, which we've been discussing. You see this, you've seen this with the election, starting with the Brexit in Britain. You saw it with the election here in the United States, which was a vote more against globalization than it was for Trump. It was a vote against what has been happening in terms of the collapse of standards of living, the rising death rates, suicide rates, opioid use, the collapse of manufacturing, the collapse of healthcare. You had this with the vote in Italy, the referendum, which essentially would have destroyed the sovereignty of Italy and placed it directly under Brussels decrees, was rejected 60% to 40%, an upset, and led to the resignation of the government there, as the Brexit led to the resignation of the government, the Cameron government in Britain. As is generally being recognized, this is a growing phenomenon. Positively, profoundly, we have the development of the Belt and Road Initiative of China, which is now increasingly taking hold around the world. The conceptions are being exported. It's not a matter of going there to Central Asia or Southeast Asia or the Middle East to somehow get on board the new Silk Road, the Belt and Road Initiative. But it's being recognized that this is a new paradigm, a new perspective. A couple of examples. First of all, most importantly, and if you could put that first image, we'll just use a couple of images here today. This is going to be putting up a map of the area of East Russia and of Japan and the area around the Sea of Japan. And what was just concluded, the 15th and 16th of this month of December, just concluding yesterday, were a set of negotiations between President Putin of Russia and Prime Minister Abe of Japan and their governments. Putin was invited to Japan and to Abe's home prefecture for meetings and discussions. Over 60 major economic development projects were signed, memorandums of understanding and so forth. A investment fund of $1 billion, a joint investment fund was created. And now there's discussion. If you see there on the upper right, you see the Sakhalin Island. There's now a proposal on the table being discussed by Russia and Japan of linking Russia through the Sakhalin Islands to Hokkaido, the northernmost island of Japan, so that the Sakhalin Island becomes a bridge now between Japan and Russia, as opposed to an area of contention with the Kuril Islands, which stretch off there to the right, the upper right, rather than there being a dispute over those islands. And the Sakhalin Islands, half of it was once under Japanese control. Instead, there's a resolution of these long-standing problems that date back to World War II. There's never been a peace treaty signed between Russia and Japan since World War II. What Putin and Abe have initiated is a program of economic cooperation and economic development of this far northern region of Japan as part of a broader development of East Russia and Japan and Korea and the entire region. You see there in the middle, more or less, of the picture, a little bit to the left of the middle, you see the Japan Basin, and then you see Vladivostok, which is the largest port now currently in eastern Russia. So what's now emerging is a development program for this entire region. This is an expansion of the One Belt, One Road, and bringing together Russia with Japan, which of course is an economic powerhouse, bringing it into the picture. And you have negotiations also. It's proposed that Japan now join the Eurasian Economic Union, and that will bring it into collaboration really fully with the One Belt, One Road, or the Belt and Road Initiative, as it's now referred to. So this is one example. Another example I want to mention briefly here is that Caterpillar Incorporated, Caterpillar that produces heavy equipment. I think we all know the Caterpillar yellow color. Caterpillar has released a 27-page white paper on the Belt and Road Initiative, lauding it as a major game-changing process now unleashed by China. I'll just read a section of the report. The CEO, Douglas Oberhillman, dedicated the white paper report, stating that 25 years ago, you could just feel something big was starting in China. It felt as if the country was on a mission. And this idea of a mission we'll come back to in the course of the next hour. The white paper goes on to say, China has very successfully spent the better part of the last 20 years creating the trade, telecommunications, energy, and transportation networks needed for a modern economy. The task now is to maximize the return and productivity of those assets through innovation in various spheres: technology, engineering, process, business model, governance, policy innovations. The Belt and Road is an innovative strategy that will be a cornerstone of this success. It is considered by many to be the third opening up of China, and the establishment of special economic zones in the 1980s was its predecessor. Anyway, the report goes on from there, but this paper from Caterpillar, and Caterpillar now has major production capabilities, plants and units throughout China, which are producing for the China market. And of course now they're producing for the Silk Road projects that extend throughout Central Asia into West Asia, into Iran, and now potentially beyond in terms of a reconstruction program for Syria and North Africa. So these are just indications of what's going on. I also will mention that the current issue of Fortune magazine has a feature article on titled China's $3 trillion spending spree, which discusses the One Belt and One Road, states, as we've referenced this ourselves in the past, that what's now underway in terms of these enormous projects, ports, rail, communications, oil and gas, highways, and so forth, energy, nuclear power, and so on, is 12 times larger than the Marshall Plan that was instituted to rebuild Europe after World War II. 12 times larger already. And I say that partly to kind of shock our audience, shock those people that use this to shock the people that you're talking to, because Americans are in the dark on this. Now, in the meantime, what are we getting every day? We're getting this hysteria, warmongering, which is coming from the neocons. This is what the Russian hackers, the Russians effectively, virtually, it's being said, rigged the U.S. presidential elections. The electoral college process is being called into question. Hillary Clinton is saying just in the last 24 hours that it was the letter from the FBI director as regarding the reopening of the investigation into her emails and the Russian hacking of the Democratic National Committee and the spread of this material through WikiLeaks and so on that cost her the election. It didn't have anything to do with her. You know, if you actually looked at the material in the WikiLeaks, what it exposed was the behind-the-scenes manipulations going on against her opponents and the attempts to manipulate the American people. In other words, it showed Americans another face, if you will, of Hillary Clinton, and it was one the American people obviously decided to, that they didn't like. But we have this hysteria, and I say hysteria because, as has been pointed out, the recent polls have shown that a majority of Americans or more do not view Putin or the Russians unfavorably. That Republicans, even a majority of Trump voters, now view Putin, this is in the Washington Post the other day, view Putin and Russia favorably. So the hysteria is that you have this, it's the old idea of the echo chamber. You have the media, the neocons, and so forth, the Queen of England in there somewhere, the rest of this batch, this nutty bunch, talking to themselves and pumping themselves up. But the actual effect in terms of the population, I think, is something that can be and is being overcome. But nonetheless, it's there. And I'll come back to a feature of this, which is dangerous. And if you saw or heard about or read about President Obama's remarks yesterday, first on NPR in the morning, on National Public Radio, and then his press conference in the afternoon, Obama is stating that the U.S. is going to take action against Russia based on the obvious evidence that the Russians have hacked the U.S. election process. Now, so we'll come back to that. Not that to lessen its importance, but let me just say, Mr. LaRouche, informed on this, informed on the reports, the articles, the newspaper articles, the media coverage, and so forth, just said, look, Obama is a killer. The drone killings, the Tuesday meetings to determine who will be targeted, playing judge, jury, and executioner. These endless wars that have sent our men and women back in body bags and killed God knows how many civilians. I saw only a few minutes of the press conference yesterday. It was really just tantamount to a string of lies, one after the other, on the economy, on how we've never been more prosperous. No one can deny this. I mean, this kind of language that just, it shocks you. And the first question from the press immediately sent down this road of Russia. And we're going to show Russia. And some of it will be public and some of it will be private. But I've already made clear to President Putin, threats. Now this is if you're not aware of it, and the NATO head, the head of NATO, Stoltenberg, Jens Stoltenberg, Secretary General of NATO, made this emphatic back in June that cyber warfare is a form of warfare. And if cyber warfare is carried out against a NATO country, Article 5 of NATO is activated. That is, all the other NATO countries must come to the aid of the country that's come under attack. In this case, in terms of so-called cyber warfare. So this is, so when you have the President of the United States saying that the U.S. has been the target of cyber warfare, and this is coming from Russia, and as he affirmed to CNN, he does view this as being something that Putin was directly in charge of. What you're doing is you're putting war between the United States and Russia directly on the table. And that requires that Obama be shut down. He's got, his hand has to be removed from that loaded revolver, you know, sitting on his desk, so to speak. He's got to be removed from those powers and controls that would allow him to utilize these kinds of instruments in a way which would blow up the international situation and obviously potentially blow up the world.
Does Congress have to go along with him? I mean, are we past the point where Congress has even voted on him?
Yeah, the question was that what is the role of Congress in this? Have we gone past the place where Congress can play a role? And unfortunately, formally, yes, it has. Congress is not in session. The president already has gone to war without congressional authorization, and Congress has not lifted a finger. So formally, you could say it's gone beyond the control of Congress, formally and just by the process. However, the institutions of the United States, military, intelligence community, legal, retirees, the institution of the presidency is broader than the president itself. And that presidency is activated, as it's clearly beginning to be activated around the environs of the Trump incoming presidency. If that presidency, those institutions act, Obama can be blocked, as he was blocked in going to war against Syria, if you recall, back 2 years ago, I believe it was, 3 years ago now, when he drew the red line on so-called sarin gas warfare, and then there was a countdown, and there was an intervention, which came while Congress was in recess. And it came from congressmen, but it also came from the other institutions and from the Joint Chiefs and so forth. So, so the American people have a voice in this. We have to make it clear to our congressmen, we have to make it clear to our fellow citizens what's at stake here, and that this has to be stopped. Obama has to be shut down, you know, disarmed, if you will, and otherwise, obviously, if you have to, turn off the radio and TV, you know, and stop listening to the hysteria. Go to LaRouchePAC.com and related sites, and get the information you need and the information to act on. So we mentioned this, the Japan Russia meetings that occurred over just the December 15th and 16th. We've mentioned the white paper by Caterpillar Incorporated that just came out, and the Fortune magazine that's out in the current issue, just to give a sense of the growing strength of the new Silk Road. Now, what I want to turn to for discussion here is I want to turn to an aspect of this hysteria and lunacy. But what I want to talk about a little bit, or sashay into, is the discussion of the poetic principle. And I want to do that by bringing up what's called unimaginatively these days, populism. Populism is the canard, the mime, the term that's being used to explain what happened and what is happening in Europe and on this side of the Atlantic in terms of this revolt against what is, in fact, a revolt against globalization. And the revolt, essentially a desire to stick it to the establishment, to the institutions that people see as having created their own misery and their own fears. And what I'm sure you've heard the term bandied around. Well, this is populism. This is American populism, resurgent, and of course it's presented in a derogatory fashion as well. And populism, just in terms of the root word, in terms of popular, populi, in terms of the Latin vox populi, there is the notion of it, the idea in terms of populism, that it's just, what's popular. It's something that kind of sweeps through and people get on board, and, it's like push button issues like gun control or anti-abortion or some other agenda. Yes, you can turn on the lights. These push button issues are expressions of what you can call populism. And of course, they detract from, they prevent people from actually being able to think conceptually about the broader issues, more fundamental issues. But what's going on? What we're emphasizing, and it's important so that people are not confused, right, about their own instincts, shall we say, is that this is not populism. This is something that, as Lyndon LaRouche has emphasized since I first ran into him in the 1970s, began working with him in the 70s, this is something that Percy Bysshe Shelley emphasized and developed in his A Defense of Poetry, in terms of a different feature, a different cognitive feature, a different social feature, which is so fundamental to mankind. And it's what we see coming to forward now, and it's an expression of the new paradigm. So let me just read, this is not an academic lecture. This is not going to be a detailed taking apart or whatever of a defense of poetry by Shelley. He himself would see that as completely counterproductive, since he's talking about poetry and metaphor, not about analysis. And you may wonder why poetry, but I think that will become clear to you very quick. Let me just read. This is the opening of the Defense of Poetry. This was written in 1821, so just about 200 years ago. Shelley only lived to be 30 years old, the English poet. And he died the next year after writing this piece, which is supposed to be only part one of a two-part paper. So here it goes. According to one mode of regarding those two classes of mental action, which are called reason and imagination, the former may be considered as mind contemplating the relations born by one thought to another, however produced, and the latter, that is imagination, and the latter as mind acting upon those thoughts so as to color them with its own light, and composing from them as from elements other thoughts, each containing within itself the principle of its own integrity. The one is the principle of synthesis, that is the imagination. And then he goes on just a little bit later, just the next paragraph. Poetry, and this gives you a sense of what he means. Poetry, in a general sense, must be defined to be the expression of the imagination. And poetry is connate with the origin of man. Man is an instrument over which a series of external and internal impressions are driven, like the media, like events, right? The passing events, the empirical events, like the alterations of an ever-changing wind over an Aeolian lyre, which move it by their motion to ever-changing melody. But there is a principle within the human being which acts otherwise than in the lyre, and produces not melody alone, but harmony. And he goes on, language, gesture, and the imitative arts become at once the representation and the medium, the pencil and the picture, the chisel and the statue, the chord and the harmony, the social sympathies, or those laws from which, as from its elements, society results, begins to develop themselves from the moment that two human beings coexist. The future is contained within the present as the plant within the seed, and equality, diversity, unity, contrast, mutual dependence become the principles alone capable of affording the motives according to which the will of a social being is determined to action, inasmuch as he is social, and constitute pleasure and sensation, virtue and sentiment, beauty and art, truth and reasoning, and love in the intercourse of kind. So, if you noticed in that opening, he had said that, that in the case of reason, that this is a matter of analysis. But in terms of imagination, it's the mind of the individual acting upon, right? These thoughts, these other thoughts, these elements. And then I'll go to the conclusion here to give you a sense of where we're going with this in terms of a process. He says, the most unfailing herald, companion and follower of the awakening of a great people to work a beneficial change in opinion or institution is poetry. At such periods, there is an accumulation of the power of communicating and receiving intense and impassioned conceptions respecting man and nature. The person in whom this power resides may often, as far as regards many portions of their nature, have little apparent correspondence with that spirit of good of which they are the ministers. But even whilst they deny and abjure, they are yet compelled to serve the power which is seated upon the throne of their own soul. Now, that gets at the poetic principle. What's happening, what we're seeing in terms of the emergence of this new paradigm around the world is mankind suddenly discovering, men and women, rediscovering their imagination, rediscovering the possibility of changing the future, to make a better world. And as Shelley makes the point, this is the quality of love, right? And so as we find ways in which to now express this, right, then the power, the political power, the intellectual power of mankind is unleashed. So let me just let's go back to the space program. That was a crash program. Many of us were around then, at least as kids or as young adults, and others have been inspired by it since. And what I want to just to remind people just directly of the scope of this, of what people such as President John F. Kennedy had in mind, but do it from the standpoint of thinking about this question of poetry and thinking about the One Belt and One Road initiative in terms of what we're about right now. And I also would think about John Herschel Glenn Jr., John Glenn, the astronaut who passed away December 8th, who is certainly both one who was inspired and also inspired. So here's a short audio clip. We don't have a video for purposes, for copyright reasons, but we have available an audio clip. This is John F. Kennedy at the United Nations, September 20th, 1963, his last address to the UN. We're just going to listen to a short portion of this approximately 30-minute speech. And with that, let's just play it here. I hope you'll enjoy it.
Why do we have the lights off if it's audio?
I don't know. You can turn on the lights, John. That's all right. You probably thought a video was coming up, and I may have.
Okay, to hear better,
Right.
right, John?
All right. So this is John F. Kennedy. This is an audio tape of his speech to the United Nations. You have volume? Oh, can you back it up? No. Oh, we're going to start this again. Can you turn it? Is it up all the way? Or?
As far as I can get it.
Can you turn it up, Mike, there on your volume?
Yeah.
That's not too bad.
And we must not put forward proposals for propaganda purposes.
Is that the
Finally, in a field where the United States and the Soviet Union have a special capacity in the field of space, there is room for new cooperation, for further joint efforts in the regulation and exploration of space. I include among these possibilities a joint expedition to the moon. Space offers no problems of sovereignty. By resolution of this assembly, the members of the United Nations have forsworn any claim to territorial rights in outer space or on celestial bodies, and declared that international law and the United Nations Charter will apply. Why, therefore, should man's first flight to the moon be a matter of national competition? Why should the United States and the Soviet Union, in preparing for such expeditions, become involved in immense duplications of research, construction, and expenditure? Surely we should explore whether the scientists and astronauts of our two countries, indeed of all the world, cannot work together in the conquest of space. Sending someday in this decade to the moon, not the representatives of a single nation, but the representatives of all of our countries. All these and other new steps towards peaceful cooperation may be possible. Most of them will require on our part full.
So you can look that up, and if you need a link, I'll be glad to give email you a link and to a video as well of the full speech. Recall that this comes really months after the conclusion of the Cuban Missile Crisis, when we were on the brink of nuclear war, and Kennedy had already he referenced it in the speech as well, that he had already he's already initiated and concluded certain agreements with Russia in terms of a nuclear test ban. Other steps are being taken to reduce the threat of nuclear war collaboratively. We know now, in the aftermath, that there was an ongoing exchange of letters between Kennedy, initiated by Kennedy, with Khrushchev, which was ongoing through this whole period. I think, but here is a window, right? Think of John Glenn himself, who went into space after, as a senator, worked on nuclear disarmament as a major issue. I mean, and he had been a fighter pilot in World War II and in Korea, and all the rest. But this is something he took up as a significant issue, which he thought he could play a role in, and did. When we think in terms of in terms of what was unleashed in the United States in the course of the 1960s, where Kennedy was inspiring the world to go. And we know from Khrushchev's son that Khrushchev was seriously considering this offer, but it was cut short with the assassination of President Kennedy.
His son's Professor Brown, isn't he, right now?
That I didn't know.
Yeah, I think so.
Professor at Brown University.
Or the grandson. I think
And maybe.
Okay.
Anyway, I think, okay, so now skip forward. That's the 1960s. Here we are, we're here 56 years later, or 50 years later, just a little more than 50 years. And what we have now being initiated is a new paradigm, a new crash program, a global crash program. That's really what China has initiated. President Xi Jinping of China says that this is that he's intent on, what we need to be intent on, mankind needs to be intent on, is, quote, a community of destiny for the future of mankind. That's the, and you can read his writings, his speeches, and so forth to garner more on this. But part of the problem, of course, is to grasp this possibility. It requires the imagination. If you're simply applying the other form of thinking, as Shelley starts out stating it, then you can't see it. Is it practical? You know, are these just words? He says, according to one motive regarding those two classes of mental action, which are called reason and imagination, the former may be considered as mind contemplating the relations born of one thought to another, however produced, and so forth. And he uses then the word analysis and so forth, right? Simply, you know, the juggling of thoughts, the juggling of perceptions, you know, and left there, rather than seeking a higher synthesis, which is what real strategic thinking and policy making and nation building is about, right? How do we move mankind forward, outside the box, so to speak? So we have this now being born, and this includes, of course, the domain of international space cooperation. And I think, you know, we really have to recognize, you know, that we are in a different domain. I mean, President McKinley was obviously already in the middle of this intensely. But as Helga LaRouche stated it in her speech in Copenhagen, Denmark, earlier this week, she just made a point of saying, look, I mean, civilizations, you know, used to drop out of sight right and left. I mean, we know nothing about them. You know, archaeologists come across the remnants of civilizations, you know, and they attempt to discern something about them. And we learn something, and it's important about our own past, where we come from. And that's very important. But at this point, mankind is in a position where we can't afford another set of wars. We can't afford the breakdown of civilization, because it will go thermonuclear. So mankind at this point is where we require a completely new paradigm to even continue to exist. But on the other hand, if we make that leap of imagination that Xi Jinping and others, including Abe of Japan, obviously is now making, Putin, the El-Sisi of Egypt, and other leaders are making, with LaRouche, Lyndon and Helga LaRouche, then we have, you know, the opening up of the kind of vista that Kennedy saw back in 1963 and more. So counterpose that then to Obama, and I've already emphasized the danger of this man and Mr. LaRouche's emphatic statement that Obama has to be shut down. His threats made in the last, 24 hours ago. Yeah, at his press conference and the earlier interview in NPR yesterday, Friday, you know, is a direct threat. And he's saying we're going to act, and some of it will be public and some of it will be private. And we're going to hold Russia responsible for something we produce no evidence that they ever had a role in. And of course, denying what actually was exposed by those emails and materials that became public, which the American people wouldn't have known about.
That's the
otherwise.
issue. The issue is the content.
The issue should be the content of those emails. And in case you're not aware, you have Ambassador Murray, or former Ambassador Murray of Britain, who's ambassador to Uzbekistan, has now gone public. This is, you can do a search for this. I think it's Charles Murray, if I remember his first name correctly, with the fact that he personally received the materials from a disgruntled Washingtonian working in the Clinton campaigns and DNC, who turned over to him the materials, I assume in a thumb drive or something like that.
British guy?
He met the intermediary who delivered the documents to him in a wooded area outside on the northwest side of Washington, D.C.
No kidding, I didn't
Right?
know this.
And then he, of course, delivered it to Assange, and there goes the story.
Ah.
Then there's the rest of the story, as it used to be said. So that's now. So he's saying, you want to talk about this? Come to me. This is published in the Daily Mail in Britain. It's published on, it's getting out on the website slowly. But it's of course, it's under the radar in terms of the New York Times and Washington Post. This just blows everything they're saying into the
But
cocked
he came
hat,
out
right?
publicly. I
Yes,
didn't know that.
yeah.
The man who helped
Assange.
Assange get the,
Yeah, that received, who went to Washington, D.C., met the intermediary from the gentleman who had taken these documents off of computers.
so it's the intermediary who helped, not the actual source, because I know.
No, he didn't meet him. He knows who he is. I said, I know who he is.
said, I know it's not Putin and who it is. Right.
Because I know the guy who
Who did it.
did it.
I didn't know that.
Yeah.
Yeah, Assange has given an interview too,
Mhm.
saying that as
So-
well.
So and the veterans, what is it, VIPs, Veteran Intelligence Professionals for Sanity, VIPs, which are all high-level former CIA and other officers at a high level. And includes former Senator Mike Gravel is among them, but there's McGovern and others. Put out an analysis of the of what has been made available, by the CIA, which is the actual organization that's supposedly has a study, because we've only know about this through a leak from the CIA to the Washington Post. That's really, and then other people have waded in or whatever. But the point is, what VIPS presents in their documentation, and again, you can just VIPS, if you put that in, I'm sure in a search engine, you'd find them right away. They point out that thanks to Mr. Snowden, we know the NSA, National Security Agency, vacuums up everything on the internet. And they would know immediately what was being hacked and who was hacking it, and what was moved in terms of materials and so forth. They would know that. The NSA would know that. So, but the NSA, there's no evidence been put forward, and they would have put forward the evidence if they had it. And what Ambassador Murray is saying, of course, and VIPS also from their own assessment is that the obvious fact of the matter is the reason there's no evidence is because there was no hack. There was a leak, and leaks are entirely different than hacks. And you don't do a leak from Russia. You have to be on the inside and provide the material, and that's the reality. And their assessment is more detailed, but nonetheless, that's the essence of it. So here is the President of the United States, at least technically, he's the President of the United States, not in principle, not in moral principle or really judicial principle. He's not.
Via fraud.
He is a fraud. Yes. Here he is threatening essentially war with Russia, which obviously is a nuclear power, on the basis of fraudulent material, or if there is evidence, it certainly has not been presented. So
Is that legal to do that? If it's not,
then it's a question of who has the will to enforce,
to enforce what is.
Court doesn't care what's legal or not.
and that's where the American people come in. The American people put through JASTA, through the U.S. Congress, right? The Justice Against Sponsors of Terrorism Act, right? The American people voted and shocked the world with the outcome of the election on November 8th. So the American people, you know, because they do have an imagination, because they're utilizing their imagination to conceive of a better world and act to bring it about, can act to shut Obama down.
Would that be impeachment or what?
Well,
How would you do
they,
that?
The main thing
It's
is to
not a
tell
matter-
the truth. Get the truth out.
yes, the key thing is to get the truth out.
Are you
How it could
telling-
work within terms of structures or whatever, that's another thing. But just as the way in which, I think it's a useful analogy, the way that Obama was paralyzed from going into war against Syria. And I believe it was 2013.
Yeah, it was.
It was, okay. You know, during the congressional recess, there was a mobilization in the institutions, also in the Congress and so forth. And literally, the day or the day before Obama walked in, you know, out to the Rose Garden speech, he changed 180 degrees, right? From saying we're going in to announcing at the Rose Garden speech that we weren't.
And the telephones
so-
on the Capitol were locked solid on account of that. It was like, you know, just millions of people literally were calling up all at the same time.
So we have to generate that kind of recognition now, but we're in a better environment. We're already in an environment in where a different kind of thinking is prevailing. There's an efficiency of ideas, and we have to take advantage of that. You know, I just think we should have a sense, an optimism informed by our own nature, our own better nature, in terms of what can be accomplished very quickly. So let me just return in a certain way, not to Shelley, but Helga LaRouche also brought up in her Copenhagen speech this week, which had numbers of diplomats and so forth and so on, very informal session. But she brought up Nicholas of Cusa, who is one of these unacknowledged legislators of the world, as Shelley called poets. But her point in bringing up Cusa in particular was the cardinal of the Catholic Church, really the key figure shaping the Council of Florence that brought the East and Western churches together, whose works were absolutely essential to the development of Western science and to the Constitution of the United States. He emphasized that the reason that different cultures can communicate is that each have produced wise people, artists, musicians, scientists, who all speak a universal language. And I think that's really important, particularly now, to grapple with or be inspired by as well. That in each nation, in each culture, you have individuals who have developed these capabilities. We need to develop more people with these capabilities. But this is the basis upon which nations and cultures have been able to communicate. In other words, the ability to share profound and impassioned conceptions concerning man and nature, as Shelley put it. That's the level upon which a cultural dialogue and collaboration can occur. And so she was emphasizing, I'll just read it, like you can have musicians from all nations playing in one orchestra, totally understanding each other because music is a universal language. A scientist who makes a discovery in one country can replicate that discovery in another country because it's a universal language. So we have to have a communication on that level of scientists, of artists, and then there will be no problem among the cultures. We will have what Nicholas of Cusa also envisioned, a harmony in the universe, because all microcosms develop into a harmonious macrocosm. And that is also the idea of Confucius, who had exactly the same idea of a harmonious development. If all develop their potentialities, you will have harmony at large, and it will also mean the fulfillment of Leibniz, Wilhelm Leibniz, Leibniz's vision that China and Europe reach out and grasp each other's hands and develop the rest of the world between them and beyond them. And this development will be not just the static development, but a contrapuntal fugue, where the development of each reaches into the other and is leading to a beautiful totality. So that's, I think, that the conception of the New Silk Road that we bring to creating out of the New Silk Road and the One Belt One Road, the World Silk Road, the World Landbridge process. And then finally, let me just end with this, just to kind of round this out. Keisha brought to my attention, I'd forgotten all about it, chapter 16 of this book, Beam Defense, an alternative to nuclear destruction. And this was the book we published back in 1983, the year of the Strategic Defense Initiative, when President Reagan adopted the program of Lyndon LaRouche to develop beam weapon systems and to share that technology and the development of that technology with Russia. And LaRouche was a negotiator on behalf of the National Security Council for this initiative, for this effort, this collaborative effort. And there's numerous endorsements on the back of this, specifically of the Fusion Energy Foundation that published it, which was our science foundation. Chapter 16 spells out the next space frontiers. Now, this is in 1983. And why I'm bringing this up is that you think about space. You think about space and you think about, the talk about we're going to go to Mars. And you think about, as I like to put it, sticking some people in a tin can and shooting them to Mars and hoping that we're going to figure out a way to get them back as well. Because that's about all that's getting talked about right now. It's that artificial or superficial. But more importantly, or just as important, think about it. Think about the space in between the Earth and Mars, or the Earth and the Moon. And we have not even begun to explore that, which is not empty. It's not a vacuum in the simple sense of the term. It's orbits. And it's a ever-changing dynamic of orbits and the interaction of physical space-time, the curvature of space, and the exploration of what is actually out there and what can we do out there. When we have astronauts or taconauts or what is it, Russian? Cosmonauts, yes. They all report from being up in orbit around the Earth, that they don't see nations, they don't see individual countries, they see the Earth, right? This blue and green, and white orb, right? But they themselves, are in orbit. They're not just floating in empty space. They're in an orbit. They're in a larger domain, right, of which the Earth then is located. And that domain, as we know from Kepler, is part of a set of orbits, and it's a gravitational field, an organized field in terms of the solar system, right, and so forth, which I think is actually part of what affects these brave people when they're looking from up there, because they're not looking just from empty space. They're suddenly in a different relationship, a larger context. But in this book, which is before the space shuttle was ever, the space shuttle was being developed or had been developed. But there was no space station yet. But what was being proposed then, which is just summarized in this chapter of the book, chapter 16, is some of the things that were being planned for what the space station was going to be used for. The space station was going to be used for manufacturing. It was going to be, satellites were going to be picked up by the space station, brought into the space station for repair, for upgrades, as new sensors, as new electronics were developed and so forth. Antennae were going to be produced. NASA was going to develop manned and unmanned transfer vehicles that would take either people or cargo up to from low Earth orbit up to geostationary orbit or geosynchronous orbit. Where more work could be done. There was already then the idea of laser communications. Lasers were being developed, of course, in the space program, in the SDI program. Well, lasers, you can carry 100-fold more information if you use lasers to communicate, to carry information, as opposed to radio waves. So, which becomes incredibly important if you're getting out to Mars. I mean, maybe it's not so important if you're simply on the moon. But laser communications and the application of this in terms of man in a domain going out to Mars, but beyond Mars. And then the development of the utilization of lasers to transfer energy from one unit, one satellite, one laboratory to another in space, that you could transfer. You could have a nuclear power plant facility, in orbit, and you could use lasers to transfer energy from that nuclear power plant to various other sources to power them as well, and so on. In other words, the space station, as we think about it today, where there's some, as Keisha and I were talking about, as Keisha, there's these nice little, there's some good stuff going on. They're growing crystals and low gravity, and they're growing flowers, and they're seeing what grows. I mean, and there's very important work that's been done in terms of man's ability to live in a low gravity orbit and to live, in an environment of cosmic ray fluxes that we don't have here on Earth, and that should warn us that going to the Mars, is not going to be a matter of putting somebody on a chemical powered rocket. I mean, they'll be dead before they get there. We're going to have to go to fusion energy. So, Keisha, I was just bringing up this book because I looked at chapter 16. Yes, Keisha just came in the room. To just point out that really, even in terms of what if we think of the example of the space station as a tiny step, a significant but tiny step, we only scratched the surface of what the space station could actually have been in the context of the broader SDI program, which was later shut down thanks to Bush and company, including landing LaRouche in prison for 5 years. But it's also what a new space program in cooperation with China, in cooperation with the European Space Agency, with Russia and so forth, what it would be today, and what we have to do to fill in the space, to learn about the space and fill in the space between Earth and the moon and Mars and beyond. So the imagination, as I was saying, as Shelley was making the point, the development now of the imagination is what's taking hold. So let me just conclude with the last few sentences of a defense of poetry, or what you could say is the poetic principle of the imagination. I'll just leave off where I'll just read the last sentence of where I left off before. But even whilst they deny and abjure, they are yet compelled to serve the power which is seated upon the throne of their own soul. And I'll continue now. It is impossible to read the compositions of the most celebrated writers of the present day. He's talking of his own day. This is the 1810s, 1820s. This is the aftermath of the American Revolution. This is the still a period of tremendous hope, without being startled with the electric life which burns within their words. They measure the circumference and sound the depths of human nature with a comprehensive and all-penetrating spirit, and they are themselves perhaps the most sincerely astonished at its manifestations. For it is less their spirit than the spirit of the age, Poets are the hierophants of an unapprehended inspiration, the mirrors of the gigantic shadows which futurity casts upon the present. The words which express what they the words which express what they understand not. The trumpets which sing to battle and feel not what they inspire. The influence which is moved not but moves. Poets are the unacknowledged legislators of the world.
That's the famous line.
Yeah, yeah. And Helga was today was making her, as I understood her speech was titled "Poets and Scientists Must Now Become the Acknowledged Legislators of the World," and I think that's the potential of the movement. So I'll conclude that. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, it's very interesting what you're tying it to Shelley and poetry sort of made me think of is that, you know, what we're going to do is it the 17th or the 18th?
For what?
January 19th,
January 19th.
Yeah.
the Martin Luther King.
Yeah.
Event.
Celebrate Martin Luther King, and what we did back earlier, I guess that was November, is that how do you recognize this process of the imagination? If you're listening to rap, if you're listening to country and western music, you know, if you're watching television, if you're, you know, if that's what you're engaged with, how are you going to recognize and participate in a process of transformation that's occurring on the globe? It ain't gonna happen. You have to find that poetic character in your own mind. How does the poetic principle work, and how do you do that? You have to surround yourself with the culture that is built on the poetic principle, and that's the argument, right? I mean, if we want,
and I would add, I mean, I think part of it is that we have to recognize that it really is up to us to be or become those poets and scientists. We have to inspire others, inspire each other, but inspire others to, you know, inspire them to touch their imagination. Sometimes it works the other way. I'm sure people, you know, billions of people are now being inspired around the globe by what's underway with the One Belt and Road that encompasses countries of at least 4.4 billion people now. The conditions of their lives and the prospects of the future, most immediately, are already being changed. And that's going to act back on the culture they surround themselves with.
right?
You know?
Yeah.
I mean, you know, if you know, so
I'm thinking about the level of purple thinking.
well, yeah. But and I think that I'm just shifting it to say, okay, and we overcome it by the inspiration we provide through, as you said, these cultural events, and the presentation of these ideas. I mean, LaRouche, Lyndon LaRouche, Helga Zepp LaRouche, our efforts, Keisha's efforts. These are efforts that are the work of poets. You know, they express in the most fundamental way the poetic principle. They spark the imagination and have been doing so, and we have to multiply that, and that's really what we're about. Yeah.
I think imagination is expressed in all these surprises behind the Trump selections. I'm thinking,
I think
who are
that's
these
fair.
people that are coming up with this? Because it's not Trump. I mean,
Yeah.
doubt it, right? But it's quite imaginative. And one of the examples I was thinking of Tillerson, right?
Here's Tillerson of ExxonMobil.
Who's being drafted to be Secretary of State. And he has these incredible international connections that are connected to huge infrastructure projects. And that's
Including the Sakhalin Islands that we were talking about in terms of the Japan-Russia negotiations. Anyway, this comes back. Exxon is a big investor in the Sakhalin Island offshore projects. Yeah. Betty, go ahead. I didn't mean to interrupt.
Yeah, no, so that's related. And it's just, okay, well, what if that was quite imaginative, taking someone who already is dealing with these massive infrastructure projects internationally and then having him be the possible, you know.
Secretary of State.
Would
Yeah.
that be a good thing, or what you're saying?
Good thing, that's a
It's a
good,
good thing,
Yeah.
that's a big deal.
yeah, he's already dealing with.
It's good to be friendly.
I've got a question
What
about
about
this,
Rick Perry being an energy person?
Yeah,
You can't win them all.
You can't win them all. That's, if it wasn't, the question was, what about Rick Perry? And the answer was, from Keisha, you can't win them all.
Right.
So,
I've
just
got a
make sure
question about
everybody
this white
got that.
paper that you mentioned. Again,
Yeah,
it's like,
from Caterpillar Inc.
yeah, I
the
mean,
white paper.
Caterpillar sits right there at the end of the street that I live on just about, right? I mean, it's like, you know, it's no more than about 3/4 of a mile away from my house. So, you know, if there's anybody in the world that ought to be interested in any kind of white paper like that, it's going to be Blake Farenthold. I don't believe he's even aware that exists.
Yeah, but no.
Does this white paper recommend any sort of policies or actions?
Well, it's interesting. Again, I think it's part of this. There is a, we've sparked, and otherwise a process is going on here. That's rippling through like gravity waves or something, rippling through. And so you have this Fortune magazine article, which is very significant as well, that I mentioned. China's $3 trillion spending spree.
Right.
China's $3 trillion spending spree. But it's an article on the Silk Road, 12 times larger than Marshall Plan. And essentially,
tons of dollars.
both of them, both the white paper and the Fortune article, are essentially saying, wake up, we got to get on board. This is
12 times larger in constant dollars.
Yeah, in equivalent dollars, yes.
Okay.
Yeah.
Does this white paper recommend any course of action on the part of American government or anything? Like
No, it's promoting this. It's just confirming this. Lauding it, and that Caterpillar is on board, and they are on board. And they have the chairman and CEO of Caterpillar, dating back to the early part of this year, begins making public statements, on this initiative.
Does this involve any activity on the part of Caterpillar in this country at all, or just in China?
Well, the question on Caterpillar, I mean, this is indicative. China is a huge market, and now the extended Silk Road becomes an even larger market for Caterpillar, as they're indicating. The Caterpillar in the United States is shrinking, not because they want to shrink, but because sales are shrinking. Right? Now, if you have a large-scale U.S. infrastructure project of trillions of dollars, not some just pothole thing or building a few toll roads, but a major infrastructure program for the United States, well, then suddenly there's going to be a big demand for Caterpillar and John Deere, whoever. There's going to be a big demand for equipment in the United States. So that could come into play. Now, Paul Gallagher, the economist with the EIR, was pointing out that in terms of creating a credit institution, creating a national bank, which is the only way you could actually fund large-scale infrastructure projects in terms of trillions of dollars a year. I mean, China, for example, spent $1.4 trillion last year on infrastructure domestically. What Trump campaign has proposed so far is $1 trillion over 10 years. That's a joke. So if you're actually going to go to something serious, you're going to have to create a national credit institution. If you create a national credit institution, well, Japan, which is now the largest holder of U.S. government debt, and China, which is the second largest, would have no better place but to put a portion of their $1 trillion plus a piece worth of government debt invested into a U.S. national bank. Get 4% interest, 5% interest, whatever on it. And that money would then fund large-scale infrastructure projects, which they would help build. Because right now, we couldn't build high-speed rail in the United States by ourselves. We don't have the wherewithal. It doesn't exist.
All this other stuff that we do, we don't have that kind of specific kind of technology.
Right. So we can import that back in. We can work out agreements with Japan and Chinese companies and so forth that they transfer their technology to the United States. They train American workers, they train American companies in that technology, in the process, so they become partners with them in building these projects. I'm just saying this is how, you know, this can come home.
How
You know,
many
this
high-speed
can
rail
come
systems
home.
are the Chinese working on or involved in Africa right now?
I don't know the number. There's, I mean, they're Nigeria on the, you know, on the West Coast. There's Kenya. There's Ethiopia. There's there's Djibouti.
They're talking about linking all the capital with that.
Yeah, yes, John brings up that there's an agreement that was reached months ago, and I don't know the status, but the agreement between the OAU, the Organization of African Unity, with China to link all the countries of Africa by rail and highway, which, I mean, you can't even get around Africa right now. But, and it's no fault of the African countries, that's the colonial system that they were left with. So that's in process, but I don't know. I can't speak to details on that. But that's.
And one of the questions involves, you know, like this last little thing that I've seen from EIR, right? And are you recommending that the military try to do something with Okapunga at this point, or?
No.
Exactly.
No, but look, the American institutions and the American people can shut Obama down. That's the point. How it actually works out. The point is just get a wind behind the sails here. Just get it moving immediately so that this guy does not pull something off vis-a-vis Russia or China for that matter, that spins things out of control. I mean, you can see they're trying to, you know, they're trying to leave the incoming administration. I mean, this is just a feature of the thing, with a mess, right? Obama's trying to do everything he can to wreck things on the way out the door. That's
what it looks like.
But it's not just that. If it was just that, I mean, that's pretty small change.
Looks like he's trying to inflict maximum damage.
Right. But let's make sure that it's not permanent damage. Let's make sure we're around here for the next administration.
Yeah.
So let's make sure that we shut Obama down now, so that he doesn't do it. So that spread the word, get people thinking about this. This is the real danger of the anti-Russia hysteria, is to the extent that it provides a context in which Obama can, and his neocons think they can pull off something like this.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, just thinking about that, making that point, it's also the fact that, you know, just think that when we were warning of the evil policies of Obama and that this man needed to be impeached, and I led a campaign for U.S. Congress. Mr. LaRouche called for and calling for Obama's impeachment. Mr. LaRouche continued to call for Obama's impeachment. You had people who would say, well, don't worry about it. In 2014, the new Congress is going to go in, the Republicans, they're going to do the job, they're going to take care of, you know, Obama, and they're going to put him in his place. And what the hell happened? They did not do such a thing. And now you have people who are saying, oh, I'm not worried about anything. My boy Trump, he got elected. Everything is going to be all good. You know, but people are really out of reality, not thinking that this president is, I mean, first of all, I think this president is going to kind of go out smoothly and let Trump come in, and they're going to shake hands, and Trump's going to be the new president, and everything's going to be fine. It's not going to work like that. The British Empire, Obama, Wall Street, they are pissed off that Trump got elected and that we have a new potential in this country to move the United States with the new paradigm. And if people are sitting here and saying, you talked about it, Brian, this whole idea of a great moment finding the little people, and this idea that people are sitting here after this big repudiation that we saw around the world, that people decide we are going to put an end and go against the policies of war, against Hillary, against Obama, and then we're just going to vote and wait for this guy to come in and do something for us. I mean, it's just complete insanity.
Yeah.
So I think more people are actually waking up, or should be waking up, that it's not just going to be smooth sailing from now until January, whatever day the inauguration is.
But there's one thing I can think of that, you know, that may have overlooked, right, which, you know, you might could use as a motivation or as a rationale